Welcome to Mile High Reefers. I'm Scott Anderson, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about one of the coolest coral mounts I've ever done, and it's that one right there. Looks like a torch, but that ain't no torch. You probably already know what it is from the title, but we'll go on to why this is such a cool mount. Earlier, I had a Sinarina mounted up here and another Sinarina down here, and I ended up trimming this Monty back right here. And of course, the Sinarinas bleached out because they got too much light. Now I've got stuff hiding it back in the back so that they're shadowed. But then I had this kind of medium to low light space with nothing to put there, and it was a good size space. At the same time, I had a Helio growing out in the nano tank. It sounded like the right time to move it to the big tank. So what makes this mounting cool? Well, first, it's in a shadowed space, and if I just glued the coral directly to that spot, it would have been sideways instead of flat, or at best like that. And it would have been too shadowed to make that coral happy. So I got a little piece of rubble rock. Yeah, whenever I get dry rock, I save all the rubble rock. This stuff comes in super handy. Found a piece where the bottom was a bit rounded, matched up with the curvature there, kind of the right size. Used my trusty Max Spec epoxy. This is a 2-part epoxy. Mixes up in your hand. It really doesn't get too messy, and it gives you that kind of purple coralline color. The downside to using epoxy all by itself is it takes a while for this stuff to set up and dry. So with the epoxy, I use some of the Max Spec glue. And here's kind of a picture of what I did. Basically, I put the epoxy in the center, and then I put the glue around the outside, smashed it up onto the rock, kind of kneaded the epoxy and glue to a position where it would kind of hold, and held onto it for a couple of minutes, and it dried and it held in place. Most of the corals I mount, I just use super glue. This needed to be strong. That's where the epoxy comes in. For really strong mounts, something that I don't want to break, I'll use epoxy to hold it together. So in this case, the epoxy glue combo worked perfectly. I got the strength and the color I wanted using the epoxy, but I got the fast dry time that I was really hoping for, because I don't want to sit there and hold it forever, using the glue. Glue epoxy combo is my trick. Okay, so now you're saying, Scott, that's cool, but everybody epoxies rocks to rocks and makes little ledges for you to glue coral on. That's interesting, but it's not the coolest thing you've ever done. Now, what makes this the coolest thing I've ever done is the coral that's mounted to it. And that's Helio Fungia. It's a plate coral, and it's mounted to a rock. Okay, so the first comment that probably went down there is, you're an idiot. You never, ever glue plate corals to rocks. For the most part, that's right. But let's talk about plate corals and what happens to them. Plate corals in the wild, they get big. Foot across is not uncommon. But like everything, they die. So sad. Oh, but plate corals, they have the most amazing regenerative abilities. And I'll link an article from Reef Builders down below, because Jake kind of explains how these corals work way better than I ever could. And I'll link that down below. But when those corals die, little pieces bud up and new corals come off of it. Now, these corals have a stem, and attached to that stem is the plate. As they grow, they kind of push into each other and break off. Well, that's where this coral came from. It's a fun story. Back in the day, when I was selling wholesale for Aquamatic Live, I was cutting up torches And I had a bunch of torches. I was cutting them into single heads. And while I was cutting torches, these ones looked real weird, but I was just slicing and, just gluing to frag plugs. So I just sliced them, glued them to frag plugs. Well, it wasn't until they started to open up and they were on frag plugs that I'd realized what I had done. I had a Helio Fungia, a relatively small one, that had died and sprouted off babies. What I was cutting off weren't frags of torches, they were Helio Fungia. Well, I took my little frag of Helio Fungia and I put it in a 24 gallon and I mounted it high in the tank under a lot of light and a lot of flow. And it grew. And it grew really well. In fact, the little nub that used to be attached to the bottom of that plate is still in that 24 gallon tank. It's still over there. Well, that coral did so well, it grew that big. It went from something the size of a head I was confusing with a torch head to that in 2 years in the 24 gallon nano. But it's always been glued to a rock like this. So I figured, you know what? Let's run with this idea. Let's glue it to a rock in here. Let's give it lots of light, lots of flow, and a lot of room to open up and expand out. And so far it's worked perfectly. But you guys probably think, well, fungias, they need to be in the sand bed. They need to be able to move. Helios don't seem, in my opinion, to really care about this as much as some other fungias. I've had big Helios before. I've had tables full of them. And unlike your smaller, like helmets and regular fungias, the big Helios don't walk off the table or really move around like the little guys do. The big Helios seem fine to just sit where they're at as long as they got the right conditions. The other day at Weekend of the Wholesaler, I picked two up and looked at the bottom, and you can see where the nubs are. These are good size Helio plates. Oh yeah, Weekend of the Wholesaler? That's when I turn hammerhead corals into mile-high reefers. It's our local wholesaler, but you know what? He's closed on the weekend, so I turned it into mile-high reefers, my store, and I sell coral directly. It's a limited time on certain Saturdays, so if you're in the Denver area and you're looking for the coolest coral at great prices, follow me on Facebook. That's where all of the updates for Weekend at the Wholesaler will be. So if you want to go to Weekend at the Wholesaler, follow me on Facebook. Mile High Reefers, the real Mile High Reefers, linked down below. But let's get back to those actual corals and let's look at the bottom of them. Those big Helios, you can see they were attached to something once upon a time. And that hole looks good enough that if I wanted to, I could glue them to a rock just like this. So I've taken it from a nub and grown it out to a good size. This isn't big by Heliofungia standards. By Heliofungia standards, we're talking like a foot across. But he's grown big and he seems happy where he's at. How big will he get? Will he push himself off? These are all the things we're going to learn. So what I want to know from you guys is who's kept Heliofungia long-term attached to the rockwork? How did it work out for you? Let me know. In the comments column, if you haven't kept it, let me know what you think of this idea. Because this is a look that's amazing. It's a big flowing coral that gives you that torch look, but it's bigger than most torch colonies. And believe it or not, that costs less than a torch. And we get the pinks and we get the greens, and it seems happy and it's been easy. Now, Heliofungia has a reputation for being difficult. I've watched videos from other YouTubers who say they're almost impossible to keep. That's not been my experience. I've sold them wholesale. They always did great for me. I've kept them long term, and it's always done great. So what's your experience? Put it in the comments. Like, comment, subscribe, and go down. Find Mile High Reefers on Facebook and follow me so you can get all the latest updates to Weekend at the Wholesaler. So we'll see you on the next one. Like, comment, subscribe.